We are drawing near to the close of our course. We've covered a lot of material in the previous 70 lectures, material that's provided us with a solid understanding of key concepts in biology, concepts which I hope allow us in turn to understand how the science of biology, the science of life, if you will, affects our everyday lives and how it may shape our future. You'll recall that I organized this material around three major themes. In the first third of the course, we used the concept of information and evolution as the focus of our discussion of how living systems work. In the middle third of our course, we shifted our focus to the dual concepts of development and homeostasis, and we looked at the structure and function of living systems from this different perspective. Finally, we're now completing the last third of the course, which has had as its focus the concept of energy and resources. The major point that we've come back to time and again in this last third of the course is that life is costly. By costly, I mean that the structure and function of living systems at all levels in the hierarchy of life depend on energy and other kinds of resources. And specifically, we've seen that the structure of living systems at any level often can be understood in light of the fact that there may not be enough energy and resources available to pay those costs entirely. Now that we're nearing the end of the course, I thought it would be a good capstone to turn explicitly to the question of how the science of biology has impacted our lives. We've touched on the significance of advances in the biological sciences at various points throughout the course. Now what I'd like to do is to focus on this issue more directly and spend some time, the time remaining to us, considering the most important ways that biology and our understanding of this subject influences the world we live in. Of course, this is an impossible task. I mean, as I pointed out in our very first lecture, the social and economic and political significance of biology is pervasive and is expanding at an astounding rate. There's little in our lives that's not affected by advances in this area or that would not benefit from our greater understanding of how life works. So then where should we focus our attention in these last lectures? What I'd like to do is to stay with the final theme of the course, the theme of energy and resources. Of course, this provides a convenient focus because this is the theme we've just been discussing. But I'd also argue that it's an apt focus for another reason, a reason that can be summed up with the following interesting observation. When I was 5 years old, the human population on the planet was less than half of what it is today. Specifically, the human population when I was 5 years old was somewhere in the ballpark of about 3 billion, and now it exceeds 6 billion people. In fact, anyone older than about 40 years old can make the same claim. Anyone older than 40 years old has seen the human population double in their lifetime. And depending on the estimate you use, it's very possible that a child born today could easily live to see the human population double again, from about 6.3 billion, which is where it's at about today, to well over 12 billion. Now, when I was a child, I would have thought that it would be some sort of really rare achievement for somebody to live long enough to experience something as momentous as the doubling of the world's population. But this is really no great feat anymore. We're all experiencing it in our lifetimes. Now, part of the reason we're able to experience the human population doubling in our lifetime is because we are all living longer on average. In life table terms, this means that the average death rate of humans is decreasing. Of course, another key part of the reason is that more of us are being born. That is, the average per capita birth rate has increased. And as we learned in our discussion of population growth models, a lower death rate and a higher birth rate means that R, the per capita growth rate of the population, the human population in this case, has become higher. As a result, the human population on the planet in recent history has experienced a pattern of growth that resembles an exponential growth curve. This observation brings me to the subject of this lecture and the next. The astonishing growth of the human population is perhaps one of the most important and interesting issues to consider in light of our discussion of energy and resources in living systems. In the most general terms, this pattern of growth forces us to ask two questions. First, what is the carrying capacity of the human population on the planet? Is there an end in sight? How will we know when we reach our carrying capacity? What will happen when we do reach it? Second, what's the impact of the human population, this astonishing growth, on the rest of the planet? What are the ecological effects of human population growth on the biosphere? How do we impact the global ecosystem, and how does this impact affect the other organisms that we share the planet with? In our final lectures, we'll first take a closer look at how human populations have grown over time. And we'll look at how human understanding of how biology works and the technology that's resulted from this have influenced these patterns of population growth. Then we'll turn our attention to the second question, looking at biodiversity on a global scale, asking how biodiversity and the global ecosystem is being impacted by the human population, and asking how these changes in turn may impact us. As we'll see, there is some bad news here, but there's also some good news, and I'll end with that good news at the end of the next lecture. Well, early in human history, after modern humans had evolved, but while we were still living as hunter-gatherers, anthropologists tell us that our species lived in relatively small, autonomous bands, numbering about a few hundred people at most. As hunter-gatherers, human populations depended entirely on the primary and secondary productivity of the ecosystems in which they lived. They had only the animals and the plants around them and nothing else from which to obtain the energy and resources they needed for their own population growth. Hunters and hunter-gatherers were omnivores, meaning simply that they, like us, ate at a variety of levels in the food chain. If they ate plants, they were primary consumers. If they ate other animals, they might be secondary or even tertiary consumers. While they were hunter-gatherers, or rather, I should say, while we were hunter-gatherers, it's almost certainly the case that the major constraint on human population growth was the fact that we depended entirely on the productivity of natural ecosystems for all of our energy and resources. Estimates vary widely, as you can imagine, but they suggest that the world population size was somewhere between maybe as few as 1 million or as many as 10 million people prior to about, let's say, 10,000 BC, or about 12,000 years ago from now. Now, if we take an average figure of 4 or 5 million, we can use this for the sake of argument. This means that there were only about 4 or 5 million people on the entire planet when we were hunter-gatherers 10 or 12,000 years ago. The city of Atlanta, Georgia today has somewhere between 4 and 5 million people living in it, just as a sake of reference. Now, as far as we can tell, human population size on a global scale appears not to have grown very much as long as we were hunter-gatherers. It seems to have been stable. Some local populations probably fared better and some probably fared worse, depending on local resources, but the total population of humans in the world seems to have grown very little. And this population size, it seems, was stable for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. In other words, the global carrying capacity of humans as hunter-gatherers was, let's say, about 4 or 5 million people. There were 4 or 5 million people, and that's the carrying capacity, or was, and that's where it stayed. Now, even if this estimate is off, maybe it was only 1 million people, maybe it was as many as 10 million people, nonetheless, the human population was maintained at this carrying capacity as long as humans remained hunter-gatherers and relied on natural productivity of ecosystems. Life changed considerably for humans, however, in the period ranging from about, let's say, 8,000 to 5,000 BC. This period is known as the Neolithic period, and it's roughly during this time that humans figured out how to domesticate plants and animals. The domestication of crop species and food animals was perhaps the first significant application of an understanding of biology on the part of the human species. Although primitive by our modern agricultural standards, the ability to domesticate species required some basic intuitive understanding of the science that we would eventually come to call genetics today. If nothing else, humans learned to understand the significance of the fact that offspring resembled their parents. And they used this understanding to change some of the plants and animals they found around them to make them more useful to them, to change them for their own benefit. Now, the social consequences of domestication eventually changed human societies in a number of ways. It eventually gave rise to more permanent villages as dwelling places and a greater division of labor in human societies. But more importantly, from our point of view, the ecological consequences of domestication and agriculture for the human species was that the supply of energy and resources available to humans became both larger and more predictable. The result of having more resources, and having more resources that were predictably available, was to raise the global carrying capacity for the human species. There was more food available, and so of course birth rates rose and death rates decreased. As a consequence, the world population size began to grow steadily in the Neolithic period, eventually increasing by orders of magnitude in just a few thousand years. So by about the time of the beginning of the Common Era, that's AD, about 2,000 years ago, the time of Christ, the world population of humans is estimated to have been about 300 million people. Now that's close to 100 times more than the population size previous to the Neolithic period. A remarkable increase in carrying capacity. The human population continued to increase in size for the next several thousand years, or for actually I should say about 1,500 years or so, although it took about 1,500 years or a little bit more before the population size would double. Somewhere in the 17th century, the human population size increased to about 600 million people. Now, presumably, during this period, there were continued advances in agricultural techniques, or in the ability to store or transport materials, especially food and energy. So, during this period, presumably, the carrying capacity kept creeping up, probably not rising as dramatically as when agriculture first arose, but basically humans never reached their carrying capacity by this model. Now, there were some periods during this time, interestingly enough, where there were significant drops in the human population size. I mean, if there are only 300 to 600 million people, things can happen to bring that population size down. Most notably, during the 14th century, the population of Asia and Europe, where the majority of humans were found at the time, dropped precipitously because of the bubonic plague, the Black Plague that swept through Asia and then Europe. But nonetheless, the ultimate trend was an upward trend, and ultimately the improvements in agriculture led to human populations steadily increasing. They were still constrained, though, and we presume that population growth rates must have started to decrease because they were still constrained by depending solely on plants and animals as a source of energy. These plants and animals could be modified through domestication, through breeding, to become better as sources of energy and resources. But that's still all that humans had. It was no longer a natural ecosystem that provided their productivity, but it was nonetheless not very far removed from a natural ecosystem. This all changed during the 18th century with the onset of what we call the Industrial Revolution. Now, it was during the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s that humans learned how to capture the energy stored in fossil fuels and use that energy on a large scale for a wealth of other kinds of activities. The Industrial Revolution, as we said in a previous lecture, was when coal started to be mined in prodigious amounts, and humans started to use that coal, the energy that had been locked away hundreds of millions of years earlier, to increase effectively their overall productive output. This was a period of rapid advances in other forms of science and technology as well. Eventually, the mechanical energy of animal labor in specific was replaced by machines that were fueled by coal. Previous to the Industrial Revolution, the only way work could get done, the only way things could be moved, fields could be plowed and so forth, required the work done by animals that had to be fed grain or other kinds of biological materials. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution, machines powered by steam that's heated by coal could do this work. It dramatically changed the way that humans were able to produce goods more efficiently, to transport those goods, process those goods, and so on. There were also important advances related to biology more directly that influenced the health of human populations beginning during this period. Remember, for example, that Edward Jenner, the person who developed this idea of vaccination, did his work in the late 1700s. Less dramatically, but perhaps even more importantly, it was during this period that people began to understand basic principles of disease transmission and public health, leading to improvements in personal hygiene and sanitation and waste removal. Just as had occurred with the onset of agriculture 10,000 years or so earlier than this, the onset of the Industrial Revolution allowed the human species to readjust the way it interacted with its own ecosystem, and in so doing caused the human carrying capacity to increase dramatically once again. Death rates dropped globally, birth rates soared, and the human population now began a steep upward trajectory approaching exponential growth. The annual growth rate, for example, of the European population alone quadrupled between the years 1750 and 1850 in just 100 years. The population of London, one city alone, exploded from about 1 million people in 1800 to 4.5 million people in 1880. In other words, at that time, the population of London had a population that was the same as the whole size of the world population previous to the Neolithic period. It's worth pointing out here, by the way, that this was the period during which Thomas Malthus lived. Remember, Malthus was the economist who wrote the essay on a treatise called An Essay on the Principle of Population, in which he argued that human populations were undergoing exponential growth, and argued that this exponential growth could not be sustained. And remember also that it was Malthus's essay that was a key element in Darwin's thinking about the theory of natural selection. Malthus saw the human population experiencing what appeared to be exponential growth, and he pointed out correctly that exponential growth could not be sustained forever. Malthus predicted that there would soon be rising mortality rates as an inevitable consequence of overpopulation. The fact that not all individuals that are born in a population can survive eventually was a key element in the way that Darwin envisioned his theory of natural selection. Now, when Malthus wrote his essay, in 1798, the world population size was approaching 1 billion people. Now, although Malthus couldn't know this figure, he knew things were dire, and 1 billion is a pretty big number, okay? Especially since things had been measured, if they could count back then, in at most a few hundreds of millions, only just a few centuries earlier. Interestingly, Malthus predicted dire consequences should start occurring very soon, in the lifetime of the people living at that era. 201 years after Malthus published his essay, the United Nations formally announced, in fact on October 12, 1999, that the world population size had finally reached 6 billion. So Malthus, although he was right in theory, seems to have got it a little bit wrong. Nothing happened in his lifetime. The world's population size continued to increase from 1 billion when Malthus lived to 6 billion 200 years later. What happened during this 200-year period that allowed population growth to continue, presumably by increasing the carrying capacity of the human species? Well, indeed, as the 20th century approached, the global growth rate of the human population seems to have begun to have slowed down. Death rates continued to decline, but so eventually did birth rates. Now, in spite of this lowering in growth rate, a decrease in R in our exponential growth equation, the human population continued to expand exponentially. Well, why is that? Remember, the exponential growth equation is dn over dt, a change in population size per unit time, equals R times N. R is the growth rate, N is the population size. But this is like compound interest. Even if the growth rate is relatively small, as long as N is a big number, it's going to continue to be becoming bigger and bigger and bigger exponentially. The population of the world had gotten so big that it just kept getting bigger. Well, how was it possible for the carrying capacity of the planet to support this increase in population size, which it obviously did, from 1 billion to 6 billion people? The question really is, what else happened since the Industrial Revolution between then and our present day that might have affected population carrying capacity? Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, actually, scientists did begin to echo the concern expressed by Malthus, warning that the world's population size would soon exceed some sort of carrying capacity, arguing essentially that global food production was not going to be able to handle what was already a burgeoning population size. The concern really was that humans were going to overshoot some carrying capacity. In fact, if they hadn't already done so. And we've seen in other species how populations do overshoot carrying capacity. They go way above their carrying capacity with the result of a plummeting of birth rates and a soaring of death rates, potentially a very unpleasant situation to be in. But here's where humans once again redefine their relationship with the ecosystem in which they lived. In the Industrial Revolutions, humans figured out how to take advantage of energy stored in carbon that had been basically sequestered away in fossil fuels. In so doing, they actually sort of short-circuited the global carbon biogeochemical cycle. At the beginning of the 20th century, humans took control of another biogeochemical cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Remember, nitrogen is a key limiting resource affecting the primary productivity of plants, the primary productivity of an ecosystem. We all know this intuitively. If we're gardeners and we want our flowers to grow faster or our vegetables to grow faster or bigger, what do? We add fertilizer to the garden. What does that fertilizer have? Among other things, it has nitrogen. So we add nitrogen to increase productivity. Farmers add nitrogen to their fields to increase productivity. Well, up to the end of the 19th century, humans depended on organic sources of nitrogen to fertilize their crops. For example, if you add manure to a field, you're adding nitrogen to that field. There's nitrogen in the manure. But humans could only extract so much nitrogen to use as fertilizer from the natural ecosystem in which they lived. They were again limited by a natural part of their ecosystem. Then, around 1908, a young German chemist named Fritz Haber developed a method for converting inorganic nitrogen gas, that's N2, into ammonia, NH3, which could be easily converted into a form, ammonium or nitrates, that could be assimilated by plants. This process became known as the Haber-Bosch process. Bosch was another chemist who helped develop this and make it industrially, able to be used in industry conveniently. And Haber went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1918 for his development of this method. The Haber-Bosch program once again decoupled the human population from one aspect of its natural environment. With the advent of industrially produced fertilizers, crop yields were no longer tied to organic sources of nitrogen, and so crop yields began to rise. This was the beginning of what a half a century later came to be known as the Green Revolution. Actually, there's an interesting sidebar that I want to add to Fritz Haber. He's a very interesting person. Haber not only developed the Haber-Bosch process, which essentially began the Green Revolution, but then later on he was also one of the principal proponents of the use of chemical weapons in warfare. During the First World War, Haber was one of the main proponents of using poisonous gas as a weapon to break the deadlock of the war. And in fact, in April of 1915, Haber personally directed the first use of chlorine gas as a weapon in Flanders, Belgium. I think it's ironic that one of the principal contributors to increasing the carrying capacity of the human population in the 20th century also happened to be one of the people who developed one of the great scourges of warfare of the 20th century. Now, the development of synthetic fertilizers was only really the first small step in what became an extraordinary increase in productivity of food crops and world food production in the 20th century. The next step in what's been called the Green Revolution was probably taken in 1944 in Mexico by a biologist named Norman Borlaug. Borlaug was a plant physiologist who received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1942. And in the same time, the Rockefeller Foundation was negotiating with the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture to establish an experimental plant breeding station in northwest Mexico designed to develop crops that had higher yields. Borlaug was offered and accepted the position to direct this project. Now, Borlaug worked tirelessly, and what he was really doing was just crop breeding. I mean, something that had gone on for years before, but crop breeding with a lot of resources. And further, Borlaug personally became a crusader, not only to develop these new crops, but to get third world countries to accept these crops into their agricultural systems. Within 20 years, Borlaug's efforts as a breeder had yielded tremendous new progress. For example, he created strains of wheat that had significantly higher yields because the plants would put more of their resources into grain production and less into building just plant parts. These were dwarf wheat plants that, for the same amount of productivity, would produce more useful grain for human consumption. He also developed plants that had greater pest disease resistance. And perhaps most interestingly, he bred plants that were relatively insensitive to day length. These plants being insensitive to day length actually could be distributed more globally without any disadvantage. And in fact, if the resources were available, could be planted at different times of the year, again, increasing yield in agriculture. Well, combined with the use of industrial fertilizers as well as new technologies for irrigating plants, these kinds of breeding advances led to an astounding increase in productivity. Let me give you just one set of figures to illustrate that fact. In 1950, the world produced, an estimate is, the world produced 692 million tons of grain that was grown on 1.7 billion acres of cropland. In 1992, just 42 years later, the world production of grain had risen to 1.9 billion tons, grown on only 1.73 billion acres. That's a 170% increase in grain production for only a 1% increase in the land used to produce that. And of course, the consequence of the Green Revolution has been another potentially large increase in the human carrying capacity on the planet. It's interesting in this case to know that this Green Revolution is really often attributed to just a single individual, Norman Borlaug, not because he invented something in particular or developed a particular process, but largely because he was such a politically active and motivated person who personally worked with governments to help them develop or import new agricultural techniques. In 1970, Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize, specifically for his efforts to avert famine in Pakistan and India through the use of new crops. Well, meanwhile, the Green Revolution continues to advance. With the advent of genetic engineering techniques, we have now another whole set of tools, as we've discussed earlier, for modifying plants so they become more productive, more disease resistant, and so forth. And it's only a matter of time before the Green Revolution started by Borlaug using traditional breeding techniques creates ever higher yields of plants. In so doing, what we are going to be doing is continuing a trend that began over 10,000 years ago, or about 10,000 years ago in the Neolithic age, decoupling our own use of productivity from natural features of the ecosystem. In this case, ultimately actually decoupling productivity from genetics itself. Well, the Green Revolution isn't the only application of modern biology that affected human population size, both birth and death rates and that sort of thing in the last century. Of course, modern medicine has also had a very important impact. Just to, again, give you an example of what's happened, in 1900, the average global life expectancy on the planet, across the whole planet, was estimated to be about 30 years, right? And it had been about 30 years, people think, for about the previous 5 centuries. By 1950, the average global life expectancy had increased to 47 years old, and by 1998, it stood at 67 years old. The increase in the availability of resources, of course, had some role to play in this, but so did advances in modern medicine as diseases were eradicated and childhood mortality was reduced and so forth. Here, too, now genomics research and biotechnology is likely to even advance these, make even greater advances at a faster rate. Well, all of this seems to be pretty good for the human species. We haven't hit our carrying capacity yet. Doesn't seem like it. We continue to develop new technologies that raise our carrying capacity higher and higher, but we're still left with 2 questions. The first question really is to ask, what is the ultimate carrying capacity of humans on the planet? I mean, there has to be some carrying capacity. If we're stuck on this planet, and let's assume that we're going to be stuck on this planet for the foreseeable future, at least virtually all of us, there are only so many resources here. We can't extract more than the total amount. What will the carrying capacity be? Population biologists differ greatly in what they estimate the carrying capacity of the planet really is. Some argue it's actually as low as 2 billion, that we've already surpassed it and we haven't paid the cost. Now, optimists propose that we're going to continue to increase our carrying capacity by developing ever new technologies to create more space and to utilize resources more efficiently. It's easy for some of us to scoff at the proposals that are being made. For example, floating cities or cities in outer space. How could this possibly happen? But bear in mind what somebody living in the 17th century might have said if you said you're going to be able to plow your fields without a draft animal. They might have scoffed as well. Or imagine what somebody living at the beginning of the 20th century would think if we told them that we're going to be able to directly modify the genes of animals and plants. They would have scoffed as well. It's only a matter of time before we see whether a more optimistic estimate of population carrying capacity or pessimistic carrying capacity holds forth. And this brings me briefly to the second question we need to ask. Given this extraordinary population growth, what's the impact of our population on the rest of the planet? And this is the question we'll turn to next time.